Welcome, everybody. And today we're going to be on the fourth part of our series, but I expect the series are going to be a little bit extended because I don't think I'll be able to finish all the things that I wanted to complete. So in a way, we are going to be sort of following up to the 7, and after 7, we'll go on to series 8 type of thing. Anyway, one of the things that is very, very central to Islam, which is quite often forgotten, which is one of the reasons why we're talking about these things nowadays, is learning. And it's very, very important because it's a religious injunction that is the first revelation that came as a Quran, as a verse of the Quran, is to do about learning. And I'll show you later on that verse that came in, and we'll go through that a little bit more detail then. But it just goes to show how important learning has been in Islam. Although the 5 pillars of Islam that we sort of follow, which essentially is belief in the God, fasting, prayer, giving zakat, charity, and doing the pilgrimage. These are very, very sort of tangible things that are mentioned. But learning is not sort of part of that 5 pillars because that is the first injunction of the Quran anyway. So when you talk about the belief as a Muslim, you accept that as being very, very important. And it has been the crucial pillar of really why Muslims succeeded so well after having just migrated from Mecca to Medina with Muhammad with 70 people. And in his own lifetime, those 70 people had about all of Arabia under their control. Now, why is that? It is because Muhammad brought in a type of, if you like, ideology or religion which emphasized justice for everybody. Now, you know that it came from a tribal background. Saudi Arabia was very tribal, and each tribe had their own sort of rules and regulations, and the chief was the head who dictated terms, as it were. So when Muhammad came with this message, which was for all, then a lot of these tribes started to fall in that fold and accepted that because it was very modern for that day to have justice for the poor and for the rich, which was the same. And there are many examples of the caliphs also being held to account for their actions by ordinary people, which of course doesn't happen nowadays because we have moved a lot away from the old ways that brought about success to Islam. And we are now under different types of influences that have prevented justice being meted out in the manner that it was first enunciated. So learning, as you can see, is very much part of the dispensation of justice. And you can only give justice to those people by giving them the social, if you like, means for living their lives. So let me see what we're going to be talking about today is this agenda. It's going to be covering how learning has been imparted over the centuries by the Muslim sort of caliphs of the day. And the emphasis was, of course, on learning starting from a very early age, which we call schools here, which were called madrasas in those days. That's still called madrasas, but they have very narrow type of curriculum nowadays because they have moved away from the real sort of message of Islam and of the Quran. And of course, schools became universities because, you know, as you learned more, as you gathered knowledge more and more, this is the type of thing that became consolidated in institutions like universities. And of course, an example of that we will see later on down as we talk. And of course, this notion of a professor chair, that also came from those days where learning was imparted by a learned person sitting on a chair or some high position and talking to his students. So now we have, made that into a sort of a university type of position, which we follow as well. So that came from the ways back in time. And of course, these learning institutions had enormous amount of libraries as well. And we'll talk about that as we go down. And these libraries were the repositories of all the manuscripts and all sorts of books that were available and that were made and translated into at that time. And the subjects that they covered, of course, were quite extensive. And here I'm just mentioning maths here because I'll just talk a little bit about it today. But I will have a separate section for mathematics as such, which will be part and parcel of the studies that enable the astronomy to progress and all the exploration and the cartographic and the voyages and so on. We'll talk a little bit about the art, geometrical, the golden ratio. I'll tell you what that is. And of course, how it came into Europe thereafter. And of course, translation was the sort of thing that these universities and these other sort of learning centers also carried out. Okay, now the spread of Islam took place from 632 to 1600. This is the golden period that we're talking about. And here I coined a phrase here called juju. Juju history and media says the thing was spread by the sword. Now, far from it. Okay, part of it may be because when you are sort of living in that world of that time, people fought. And what actually happened was that the message was so strong that it got accepted very readily. And that is why we have both the Byzantine and the Sassanid Empire, which were the superpowers of the day, which were overcome by this band of 70 people, of course, after a few decades, that took over. So it's a bit like saying that all of a sudden Afghanistan is going to sort of start, taking over, Europe or America. That's not going to happen unless there is an idea. And that idea at that time was delivering justice and, of course, equality and fairness to everybody. So here is the sort of spread that has taken place. Now, initially, when the message came in, the revelation started. Muhammad had this little gray area that, after those 70 people were instrumental in coming to Medina with Muhammad. And then from Medina, they were able to extend their ideology to most of Arabia, as you can see here. I'll just make that a bit bigger. Let me see, maybe, have you ever? Okay. And then you can see, this is the gray area, and that was for the year from these are the sort of dates by which all the other ones also were, in fact, came under the influence and became the empire, as it were. So you can see within a few decades, the whole sort of region was, completely taken over in a way by these new ideologies that came about by Muhammad, or the religion. And of course, this is a big part of the civilized world at that time that came under the influence. And you can see right up to East Indies here, and of course to the west of Africa and Europe as well over there. Now, this is the injunction I was telling you. The first revelation that came is this here. Maybe if I sort of extend that, we can read it. Let me move this away here. Okay. It says the first revelation to Muhammad. Muhammad was contemplating for weeks in a cave in Mecca. And when the angel Gabriel came over and asked him to recite a verse. And of course, Muhammad wasn't literate. And therefore he says, I can't. Nevertheless, after a further sort of exhortation by Gabriel, he read. And it was like this: read in the name of your Lord, who creates man from a clot. Read, and your Lord is the most bounteous, who teaches by the use of the pen, teaches man that which he knew not. So this is the first revelation that came to the prophet. So now the pen, of course, I put a picture here because it's an invention of that time. This is not the pen that was invented there, but it did the function the same. It's a modern picture I'm showing you, but they invented the pen where you didn't have to dip every time we wrote. So the ink was flowing. So you can see it is a marvelous type of contribution of the day. So they built these many universities and schools. And the people who really were instrumental in providing these types of institutions were not only the authorities, but the people who were, if you like, philanthropists of the day. And we'll see that here we have basically saying it's a sacred injunction. And it is saying basically seek and share knowledge throughout one's life. So it doesn't stop at school or universities. It carries on throughout life. So you can see it's a very, very sort of powerful message. So now the reverence for learning was shared not only by the caliphs, but by the princes, princesses, and the wealthy merchants of the day. So they were, in fact, supportive of that idea. Because the whole message of the Quran is an equitable type of behavior, both materially and socially, whichever it may be. So in fact, the hierarchies, even in religious terms, was not there. You didn't have a priest class that that could have been there, but what they have is a class of scholars. So these scholars, they come into the churches of the day, which were the mosques, and give lectures and so on. And of course, the caretakers of the mosque, the muezzins issue the call of prayer, and also kept the premises acceptably workable. So it's this type of a setup that was supported by all the big people of the day. And this is the sort of thing that not only men did it, but women as well. And I'll show you later that we have one which is a very important name, which we don't know. I didn't know about it until lately, who have been instrumental in furthering the cause of learning. And they can do that by, doing all sorts of work in terms of, facilities and so on. Now, what happened during the golden age of learning? The Islamic age started with the rise of Islam. Of course, we said that before. But one important thing that also happened is that the introduction of paper at that time made a big difference. Now, I told you earlier on that one thing that really made for an acceleration of knowledge, if you like, of the day was the common language. Common language gave everybody a means to communicate with each other, because the translation from various books of various languages was the job of the people who translated it into Arabic. So they became, if you like, very instrumental with the introduction of paper, produced lots and lots of books that everybody could read. And of course, Arabs, I say Arabs, it's really a lot of other people as well who were part of that. So I should say Muslims over there. They saved the classical works of antiquity. And we have said this before as well, because knowledge came from the Greeks, from Persia, from Egypt, from various other, India, and they sort of brought it all together to give it that form that really sort of made the difference. Sorry. Okay, where was it given? Well, we call them where education was given during the Muslim period. During the Muslim period, madrasas. I've mentioned this. This is the term that is still used in most of the Muslim countries as madrasas. But of course, we've got these madrasas were not just schools, but they were learning centers, which had a mix of the school plus university, and of course sectioned off depending on the type of level at which you were imparting knowledge to the students. So in a madrasa, apart from religious education, the individuals were given training terms of in other areas in order to prepare them practically for life. So it was both vocational and academic that was taking place. Now here is a case of a princess, Fatima al-Firri, philanthropist of the day, 841 AD. She opened up, she was a daughter of a successful businessman, used her inheritance to build the first mosque, University Al-Karim in Fez in Morocco, and other universities soon followed in Baghdad and Cairo. So here she is. I'll probably show you a picture. We'll just extend that a bit. Here we are. That's her. So you can see she's dressed up in good clothes there, very well dressed in the fashion of the day. But she spent the money. And those learning centers, they gave studies, they brought about studies of the Quran, the theology, the logic and prose and maths, geography, medicine, and is now regarded as the oldest university. Now, where was this? And it's very, very surprising. Sorry, I jumped. No, I think I'm right there. Yeah. Okay. So anyhow, I'll show you the picture as we progress. Okay, just looking at it broadly again, what are the major contributions of the Islamic Golden Age? Well, the Abbasid, the Caliphate, you know, there are different caliphs. There were Abbasids and the Umayyads, and they were both sort of, you know, in a way from Arabia, and the roots were in Arabia. But they were both very, very much into this learning, acquiring knowledge from wherever. And this is from 9th to the 13th centuries. And this caliphate collecting the knowledge of India, China, and ancient Greece, while also making significant new contributions to mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, medicine, and geography. So again, you know, repeating, in addition to translating, they did the original work as well. Now, this University of Parvasim in Morocco, the oldest existing, continually operating, and the first degree awarding educational institution in the world, according to UNESCO. So you can see these universities have really go back in time quite a bit. Okay, this University of Sankore is in Timbuktu in the year 989 AD. And of course, it had 25,000 students. I mean, that's mind-boggling. Of course, the way was that they were not all housed in one building. It was all spread around in the village or in the town, that they had this campus which was taking care of all these students by their learned people, but they all sort of belonged to this center. amazing type of place. And is in Mali. Now, unfortunately, we hear about Mali nowadays. It's such a sort of sad situation. People are killing each other, poverty, rampant. So one could ask the question, so what happened? So the simple explanation is when the Muslim sort of era went down, these areas became impoverished. And then, of course, colonialism came in, and that didn't help too much. And we are still there. What we have now is, again, this coming back to this from 989 to the 14th century was very active. This madrasa is one of the three ancient centers of learning located in Timbuktu. Timbuktu, in our sort of expression in English, is nowhere practically, or something that is, too unreachable. But it was the center at one time. The University of Sankore has its roots in the Sankore Mosque, which was founded in 989 AD by the Supreme Judge of Timbuktu. And then a wealthy Mandika lady financed the Sankore University, making it the leading center of education. Though it is less well known in comparison to Al-Azhar University, Al-Kharazm, and the Cordoba universities, it still was very, very sort of significant in the number of students it had. So what did it do? The Sankore was able to house 25,000 students and had one of the largest libraries in the world, with between 400,000 to 700,000 manuscripts. Now, manuscripts, as I said, before the advent of paper, and as well, paper, of course, became popular. But before paper, you had something called parchment or papyrus. Papyrus came from reeds, as you may have gathered. We hear that expression from Egypt and so on. But parchment is really skin, which has been, made into a type of medium where you can write on. So here we got these types of things in humongous numbers kept there. Students were also learning a trade along with the relevant business codes and ethics. The university trade shops offered classes in business, carpentry, farming, fishing, construction, shoemaking, tailoring, navigation, etc. So really the life, if you like, skills that you need for professional work, vocational work was there. So that it provided both these. Now, the curriculum, of course, as I mentioned, in a bit more detail here, principal subjects taught at the university included, of course, Quran and Islamic studies, law, because justice is so important in Islam, and along with literature as well. Then other subjects were medicine and surgery, astronomy, mathematics, physics, chemistry, philosophy, language, linguistics, geography, history, as well as art. So you can see quite a big expanse of learning and of the day was very much of what we see even today. So they had those subjects well covered. Now, another library of that time is the one which is quite often quoted, is this House of Wisdom, over 400,000 books. Now, again, I can repeat that when 400,000 books tells us how many there were, when all of Europe had less than 10,000. And those were mostly in monasteries because, it was a dark age in Europe, and therefore learning was not really available to the common people. It was mostly in the hands of the clergy. Now, in the House of Wisdom, also known as the Grand Library. So it's either a people's type of library or belonging to the Khalifa. Well, but the Khalifa sort of, owned everything. So I don't suppose it makes a lot of difference to see who it belongs to. So here is a picture of that library of the day. Somebody's recreated that picture. Huge sort of bookshelves here, and people. And these people, mind you, are a diverse group. As I said in my last talk, diversity is the one that brings about creativity. because people think a little bit differently to what is normally sort of the way. So anyhow, that is something that let me put it back here. Okay, so here are some more pictures of the day of those libraries. Here we are. Now this is a picture in two. This is one of the, in Greece, you can see this is a picture that you find in one of the paintings of latter day sort of Greece with all its, I remember there was a picture like this with showing Plato and Aristotle, where Plato is pointing his hand to the sky and Aristotle pointing his hand down to the ground. That sort of embodies basically the two different philosophies. We'll talk about that at subsequent talks. Here is another picture. So basically it's a visual sort of representation of libraries. Here's the physical library there, quite sort of innovative and big, circular. And there you have the city map of Baghdad of the day. Quite interesting layouts. Okay, this is again the House of Wisdom, showing it from an old script where we have essentially the House of Wisdom, intellectual powerhouse during the time of Harun al-Rashid, 763 to 809. Harun al-Rashid is one of those people who fought he was one of those very enlightened caliphs of the day who, wore ordinary clothes and went into the public and places just to assess for himself, to see if the people were happy and had their needs provided for. So this is basically saying that Baghdad was a melting point that attracted minds from far and wide, drew on a vast collection of scientific, medical, and philosophical works. Now we can see, universities like Oxford or Cambridge, you have students coming from all over the world because they know the quality of education and the access to information there is historically enormous. So that's one of the reasons why even at that time of Baghdad, the same sort of thing was happening. People gravitated towards learning centers, and that created a huge amount of upsurge in knowledge. Now, Muslim world, we stretched from Spain to China. That I showed you maps earlier on. I didn't quite as far as China, but there were influences because we hear about the Uyghurs a lot. Uyghurs, Muslims in that region. We won't talk about Uyghurs because I know there's a lot of negative reporting on that. So anyhow, men and women of different faiths and cultures making breakthroughs that had lasting impact on European Renaissance. So these are the people who laid the foundation of what subsequently became the Renaissance in Europe. This is, again, a map showing the extent of that empire of that day. And you can see the Silk Road and so on that brought in knowledge and paper along with the paper making skills that impacted these people's way of life. And they were the ones who consolidated all that, which was, fragmented in different places, but they consolidated and built on that. So art is depicting the transfer of knowledge from east to west to the House of Wisdom. Okay. Now here a variety of languages. Again, I want to sort of, talk about how diversity helps. A variety of languages were spoken and written, enabling the transfer of knowledge from foreign manuscripts, Persian, Syriac, Greek, and other into Arabic. So that was the lingua franca of the day. And that is what I think was very enriching for a society to have this diversity, which of course, people like Trump, they build walls around it. And that's why they are a failure, a big failure. But those who see that there is, merit in having diversity and good exchange, they are the people on the right side of history. Now, this is the Caliph Mamun, who was also at that time very, very sort of interested in translations, and encouraged people to translate all sorts of books. And this is a picture which is quite interesting. I'll just make it a bit bigger. Now here is a scale, and this document is going to be weighed, and this is in gold. So he promised this person that any book that he translated, because he was such a good translator, that that manuscript would be weighed in gold and that gold paid to him. So you can see how much of value they put onto learning. And that sort of really symbolizes the effort that authorities did in order to bring about that stage of learning at that time. Okay, I'm just going to very quickly again mention a few names here. This is Jabbar al-Hayam al-Musa. He is a great person of chemistry, alchemist in those days. That's again in the 7th, 8th centuries, 9th century, 18th, known as the father of chemistry. He studied most branches of learning, including medicine. And he is the one who has been able to do a systematic classification of chemical substances. Well, we have something which is a modern one, which is called a periodic table, but this is not quite that. They didn't have the access to atoms and being able to sort of differentiate between that, but they took it as the properties of materials of that time and made that into classification, which is acidic or basic or whatever it may be. Now, again, we've seen this guy before. He's Al-Khwarizmi. And of course, he's known, again, it's worth repeating. He not only did mathematics and invented algebra, but was indulging in, not indulging in, but studying astronomy and geography. It was the polymaths of those days that they studied everything. And their minds were so brilliant that they were able to then bring about, in their own way, a bit of accelerated type of knowledge, because the silo type of approach doesn't go so far as to bring about new types of ideas unless you sort of have cross-discipline type of exchanges taking place. Now, he is, of course, known for his invention of algebra, which is extensively used nowadays. And of course, he also is the one who gave Arabic numerals the type of shape that we use today. And we'll see a little bit of that picture later on. They are called the Indo-Arabic numerals because they also came from India, but in a slightly different shape. So Al-Khwarizmi gave it a different type of shape as well, because it evolved over a period of 300 or 400 years. Now, he's also known for his trigonometric tables, because sines, cosines, and all that was something that he developed it further from the Greeks. The Greeks knew about the sines and the cosines and the tangents. He then sort of brought in further work on that and manipulation of these trigonometric functions to give you the results. And of course, he also prepared the Geographic Encyclopedia in cooperation with 16 other scholars. So that's the value of having, a lot of mix of people. Now, here are these people that I just thought I might mention. Kindi, we've heard of his name before. When he sort of came out with these notes, do, re, mi type of classification. So that's him. And he was an intellectual of philosophy, physics, optics, medicine, mathematics, and metallurgy. So quite a polymath in his own day. This is Tabari. Was a scholar in medicine, mathematics, calligraphy, and literature. And Razi, again, a big name. physical physical and scientist, medicine, ophthalmology, and okay, he did all the sort of work that these people did, which is multifaceted type of learning. Okay, these are the numerals. I just want to make that picture bigger. The Indo-Arabic numerals progression from 1000 to 1400. That's how they progressed. As you can see, I'll just move this away from here. Oh. Okay, here. Now this is a modern one here. See, 1, 2, 3, 4 to 9. And if you look at these closely, they have angles in them. See, this is one angle here, two angles here, three angles over here. So that is something that these they came about with some logical type of numerals. These were the early ones that came in. You can see they have resemblance to the current Arabic numerals that are being used in Arabia and even in Urdu and so on. And then they transformed it to that, and finally to this. And this transformation was done mostly by the North African Berber type of people. And from there, you can see it's only a small hop to go from there to there. And we have what we have today. In the old days, this is how they wrote these numbers down, which is very, very sort of lumbersome and not really the sort of thing that you could manipulate easily. Okay, now we can go to this one. Yeah. Okay, now on to something which I think is also important, designs. Now, you know that in Islam that you don't show representation of people, of human beings, because the idea was that if you did that, then it leads to a type of worship of that individual or that picture. So it was prohibited. And therefore, as a result of that, what the people of the day did was, if they wanted to sort of decorate something, they came up with beautiful geometric designs, and you've seen all of that, especially if you've been to Alhambra and Cordoba, you see marvelous sort of architecture of very fine, using this golden ratio. Now, golden ratio is something quite interesting. It's something that occurs naturally in nature. It's the proportion. It's a bit like having the distance you can measure from our nose to the lip as opposed to from the nose to the chin. And that is a type of ratio, of a golden ratio. So you can find that in plants, in flowers and so on. We'll see that that sort of developed quite well. And these came into Europe, these designs. And they have, of course, got the name called arabesque type of turning that came from the East. Now, from, of course, into Europe, Toledo in Spain was center of the Umayyad dynasty over there, very advanced. That was the time of Ibn Rushd, of Maimonides, and so on, really good people, good minds of the day. And they had that learning, when Muslim learning hit medieval Europe, when a massive translation exercise began in the 12th century of Arabic works from the previous 500 years. That's from various other languages. The main center of this translation was Toledo, which you can read about in more detail in chapter on translating knowledge. Yeah, that's something that, anyway, we won't go into right now. Okay, this is basically saying the books of knowledge were a crucial part of the Muslim civilization. Caliphs and high-rank Qurtubi sponsored scholarships. Yes, scholarship was, that's again, but I want to emphasize that the learning accelerated because the people with the power, the people with some resources, they get scholarships. They funded people effort towards learning and towards translation. So it was not just an effort by the Khalifa, but there were people who engaged in it who were contributing to that. And in Europe, the church, now while this was happening there, in Europe, of course, they were discouraging science because it was the dark ages of Europe. here it is. Before the reservoir of knowledge spilled north, learning in Europe was really kept in the domain of the clergy, which mainly studied the Bible. The church was the teaching institute, and in order to get a good education, you had to become a member of the clergy. But scientific or rational thought wasn't encouraged. In fact, if anyone offered a scientific explanation other than the one grounded in religion, they would more likely have been called a heretic and met with an unfortunate end. So you can see the Dark Ages came about because of that type of mindset. Whereas Islam then sort of found like a vacuum, the knowledge that came into Europe through things. Here is learning spreads into Europe from Toledo. It started to move in because a lot of people started to come to Toledo to learn and then go back. So many historians today say that the blueprint of the earliest English universities like Oxford came with these traveling open-minded scholars and returning crusaders who as well visiting Muslim universities to places like Cordoba, brought back and translated books and so on. So you can see the Oxford as well and Cambridge institutes like this, they are also basing their type of setup to what was already there in Toledo and in the house in the Muslim sort of era of the day. And here is a picture of French Cathedral School, Chartres, one of the leading institutions of the 11th, 12th century. The work done here laid the foundations for the Renaissance, as I said earlier on. Okay, as far as design is concerned, I just thought I might show you, because we know Arabic has so many different ways of style. This is the Kufic one, and this is the Nastaliq one. And they have different names, but I've just chosen a few to show you that it can be represented not only just for writing the normal sort of language, but it can be expressed in art form as well. Now, I thought I put this one up because, when I visited India last few years ago, my town where I studied as well, I went to a calligrapher there and asked him to write the names of my family. Here, this is done in, he did this in a few minutes, it's just like writing for him. Wonderful. So here's my ex-wife's name here, Shamim, Shafiq here, my name. And Sabina, that's my daughter, Tanya, Natasha, the granddaughter, Laila, another granddaughter, Sinara here. So all these names were written very, very fast, and you can say it's beautifully sort of rendered. He didn't make any mistakes. It was so easy for him to do it. Amazing. And this is a slightly different style done with the same names. So essentially, I think I'll call it a stop here because I think time is running out. We'll have a chance to do a Q&A, and we can stop the share for the moment. And I'll go back to the gallery view so you can see all of us there. Okay, we're all there. Great. So we have any particular queries in your mind? You can unmute yourself, by the way. I can't do it from here. So just unmute yourself. Okay, Judith, go ahead.
Yeah, it was very, very interesting. Thank you. I was wondering also about medicine, because I think there's some very leading doctors, well, not doctors, I mean medicine people in the Islamic world at the time as well, or did they come later?
No, it was at that time. I'm not, you see, because there's so much to talk, I did briefly. I did very briefly in my second or third talk. If you go back to the archives, you might be able to see. I did briefly a bit on medicine, essentially to highlight two aspects of it that those people already knew about and dealt with. One was the pandemic, and they had ways of dealing with that. And then the other one was the free health. So like the NHS, they had that at that time as well. So I talked about just these two aspects of it at that time. So you can go back to that talk on my archive. But I will
thank you. I
cover
will do.
medicine in a lot more detail in subsequent talks, because there's so much that they have contributed, especially, Avicenna, and their books have been text or reference book for centuries later, even modern times, until 17th, 18th centuries or up to that period. So quite a lot of contribution have been done. And we'll talk about that in subsequent talks.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
May I just say something? I thought your illustrations were really superb. Everything was so clear. Could you tell me, I don't know if I got it, that there were just 70 disciples originally, and how did they expand to such an extent? Was it through war or what?
Well, this is the common sort of thing that is made out to be the simplistic way of saying Islam was spread by the sword, because there's hardly the sort of the fact. The reasons that it expanded first and foremost was that the message of the Quran was very acceptable to the people in every land practically, because it went beyond the tribal culture, which was the Saudi Arabian culture at that time. And when it became uniform for all the tribes, which is what the code of the Quran gives, then everybody sort of followed it. Because there was, a lot more justice in that message that was given out. And once they got themselves together with this good message, then the two superpowers of that time, the Sassanids and the Byzantine, they of course they wanted to crush them. Mecca was one of those people who wanted to crush, in fact, Muhammad in the early days. And these empires were also wanted to crush the Muslim sort of upstarts, as it were. So there were battles. And now one of the reasons why there were battles is because this region controlled a lot of trade, because trade went through this region. And therefore there's very rich pickings to be had because of the routes. So fighting then came about in some ways because of that. But really, I think what made the difference is the message that came through of justice and of learning and of equitable distribution of wealth. Those sort of ideas spread very well and were adopted.
Enlightenment, in fact.
Yeah, a sort of enlightenment of the day.
That sort of sums it up. Yeah,
That's
very
it.
interesting. Thank you so very much.
Yeah. Yeah, Pam.
I was interested in the Moroccan princess. Did you say she was the first one to form a university? And was it in Morocco that she formed the university?
No, that was in Timbuktu.
So she did it in Timbuktu, but she was Moroccan. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, no, there was another thing in Morocco that was set up by another person. But this one was in Timbuktu. Now, I get mixed up with these two ladies. Sorry. This lady, yes, you're right. Fiery set up the university in Morocco. But the one that did was another lady called Mandika. So between these Timbuktu and the Moroccan ones, these two ladies were instrumental in setting up the learning institutes of the day.
That's amazing. Very advanced. Considering
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, to have in Timbuktu, I mean, at that time, 25,000 students. I mean, it's mind-boggling. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. I had no idea. And even now in Morocco, I suppose it's one of the more sort of modern Islamic cultures in Morocco. They're very open. And, yeah.
I think what tends to happen in Muslim countries is that, that the religious sort of authorities come forward and say, we are the ones who are authorities that can tell you what you can do, what you can't do. And a lot of the learning has disappeared, and only these rituals have taken their place. And these religious leaders have unfortunately not imparted the real sort of message of the Quran. but just the ritual. And
Well, what strikes me is that the place of women seemed to be on a much higher level then than it is now, where they seem to be very subservient.
Absolutely, because patriarchy came in very much once the message started to get, eroded. And one of the reasons that, of course, I also mentioned earlier on is that at its peak, in a way, the Mongols came in and destroyed, a lot of the learned people and the institutions that were there at that time. But before long, they sort of disappeared, and whoever were left there, they became Muslim. So there was just a little spurt of destruction that caused about, but that it left an impact. And what the traditionalist religious leaders then did was to turn the society away from scientific and knowledge areas towards more religious, saying, you have been destroyed because you are not following the strictures of the religion as they expounded it. So, really that was the real injustice done to Islam to a large extent.
At about what year was that? At what time?
Well, the 13th, 14th century is when it started to decline. I think the 13th century is when the Mongols came in and destroyed that whole setup there. And of course, it then moved over to Spain. Spain lasted longer. And from Spain came the knowledge came into Europe and through Italy as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jim.
Countries and what areas are they trying to get back to bringing in science and working across silos? There must be movements now which are facilitated by the internet, whereas before it would have been very difficult to have a conceptual change back to the old ways of science. Now it's a facilitate and what countries is it happening in?
Well, you see, Jim, what I find to be rather sort of a big setback was after the First World War, Turkey's Khalifa was removed, by Ataturk, officially. But unofficially, I think the colonial powers are behind it as well. Because I remember my grandfather in India was one of those people who joined in making the demand of the colonial powers of that day to keep the Khalifa. Now, the Khalifa is a bit like the Pope in some ways. So what it did do is it united the Muslim thought somewhat by having a Khalifa, giving some basic simple edicts like the Pope does nowadays. For a big community like the Catholics, there would be all over the place if it wasn't for the Pope. Now that's what's happened to the Muslims. When the First World War ended and the Khalifa, despite, you see, the British reneged on the promise. They said they would retain the Khalifa, but then Kemal Atatürk came in and said, no, we don't want you. So it was one of those type of moves that, set Muslims back quite a bit because they became fragmented all over the world and having their own edicts and various types of sayings, which basically meant that they were sort of, at loggerheads with each other.
Yes, Shafiq.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much. My wife, sorry.
Thank you, Mark.
But the Mughals were very powerful in India, weren't they, Shafiq? Because they built this Taj Mahal and all those monuments. And
you've got to be a little bit careful as to, well, they have their origins in Mongolia, but they were very sophisticated Mughals. They're not Mongols. They had their origins in Mongolia because their forefathers came from there. But they were really people from, Persia and that sort of region that came in. And Babar, if you know, the
Yeah,
first
yeah.
guy. So
Human.
he came in because he was trying to escape the Khanats of the day, which the Mongol Empire was huge, all of Asia
Yeah.
basically, and it split, and it had people who were progressive and less progressive, and the more progressive ones came into India,
They built
and
Taj.
they were highly
I
sophisticated
mean,
in
the
their
Taj Mahal was amazing, wasn't it?
amazing, even to this day. That
Even today, yeah, you think we
yeah.
can build it.
But
And
what
how
was
did they
their
do it?
religion? Weren't they Muslims in their religion?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
What was their religion? I thought they were Muslims.
No, Mongols were not Muslims, but
No,
The ones in
Mughals
India,
were.
the
Mughals.
ones in India, like Shah Jahan and all of
They were
Oh,
Muslim.
but they are not Mongols. They are
Yeah,
Mughals.
well, that's what we were talking about India and the Taj Mahal, and he happened to have built it.
Yeah,
So
these,
that's
these are
why.
Mughals who had origins in Mongolia,
Oh,
but they were really not Mongols as such. The Mongols were people who are not Muslim.
They were Berbers,
No, they were people from Mongolia.
Mongolia.
Yeah, they're descendants of Genghis Khan and Halagu. These were the big names, and they sort of conquered many lands. And there were, of course, big territory that they occupied. And part of that was also impinging on Persia of the day. And they then adopted some of those things, and then they became Mughals and came into India.
but they were very powerful in India, weren't they? How did they?
Yes, yes.
Is it the British that threw them out or something? The arrival of British.
Yeah, well, in those days, you see, Britain had the technology basically because they were a very good seafaring nation. And they also sort of started to, come into these lands which were very prosperous. India was, like a gold mine for Britain.
Yeah.
So when they came in and saw the immense sort of role that the rulers had done, although there were many rulers, in India at that time, Rajas, Maharajas, and
Yeah.
so on. But they came all under the Mughals at one time, and they left a legacy, which, as you can see in the buildings of the day of what we see today. But they
Yeah.
were very sort of moderate people, and moderate in the sense that there are lots of bad stories. This is what I call juju history being put out, saying that the Mughals were very terrible people and they killed off all the Hindus and all that, especially Aurangzeb. That's not so. Aurangzeb, as is the case that I was looking at a clip, this scholar has read about him and researched and found out that he supported, even funded some of the temples in India. He was a very simple man. But the way that it happened in history is that, you see, when Britain came into India, they found these two communities, Muslims and Hindus. And it was a very good thing to get the majority on their side by depicting the Muslims as the baddies,
Yeah.
which is the same case even today. Muslims are
Yeah.
presented as baddies all over the world, which is really the juju media and juju history. That's their calling.
Yeah. But I mean, Mughals did a lot. I mean, there are a lot of monuments apart from Taj Mahal.
Oh, yes, yes. Full in
Yeah,
Lahore.
I mean, Taj Mahal is.
I'll be talking about the architecture in one of my talks, because there's
Yeah.
Spain and there's, of course, India, and there's all the other sort of
But
places.
even, we went to Gibraltar and there's a mosque there in Gibraltar, which is, right at the point, highest point. How
That's a rock. On
everybody
the
was
rock
saying,
itself, you mean?
I mean, the mosque is, the rock, but the
Yeah.
mosque is there. And at the moment, it's not operational. There's nobody there worshipping, but it's still there in a very nice position, where all the meat and that, nice restaurant there,
All right.
we were just,
Something I find it very interesting that you had the Muslims, they were given Pakistan, and the Hindus, were given India. You had that partition. So Pakistan became a Muslim country, didn't it?
but at one time when they fought for independence, Hindus and Muslims fought together. Pakistan and India it was only one country, and they fought together for the independence. And it's a shame after independence, how they split up, and it just Terrible, isn't it?
Mm.
Well, if you see the history as it has sort of unfolded, um, the the way that things have shaped up in India, I think, are probably less than desirable, because the Congress party was the party that was very, very secular, whereas the party that is now in power is less and has adopted a more rightist agenda. So we have people in Pakistan saying, look, if you had stayed there, it would have been even worse for us. So in a way, those people in Pakistan, they're sort of making their own life. And I think they say that I'm not happier that way.
Mhm.
Okay, how are we doing? Oh, George, what's happened to you, George?
Hi, how are you, Shafiq? I'm just listening. This is learning.
Usually you have something to say.
No, I've been down the swimming pool. I'm a bit knackered now.
I see.
George, don't you want to say something about, at one time, India would have been a communist country, and the states in India, like Kerala, which are communist, they voted for communism, are the most prosperous, because they said all the children will have free school meals. Nobody pays, even if you're a millionaire, your child doesn't pay. So nobody has to queue up in one side and the other. And those are the most prosperous states today, So, George, your left policies work sometimes.
And
I think
also,
that should be the case here. All
No,
children,
absolutely.
we should just have.
Ansua, one
Yeah.
other thing that you could also mention about Kerala is that they have the highest literacy rate in India.
Exactly. 98%.
Yeah, absolutely.
And,
And also the most diverse state.
Absolutely.
A third Christian, a third Muslim, and a third Hindu.
Yeah. And the Muslims, you could have a taxi driver and, and they tell you a lot of nice things. And, people are just, if you go to Cochin, you've got this market, there is a synagogue there. I mean, they call it a Jew street. They're so blunt,
No, but that's what it is
Street.
called.
This is a Gujarati street, and it's just amazing, isn't it? And everyone living side by side,
Yeah, I don't see why people should fight. They
Exactly.
only fight because the leadership incites
Yeah.
them, saying all sorts of nasty things about the other.
Yeah. That's what
The
it is.
classic, slogan.
Yeah. Well, divide and rule, isn't it? So-
Yeah, basically.
It was the Raja that gave them money to build the synagogue initially. He
The what?
welcomed,
The synagogue
he
is still.
welcomed the Jews over there. He did. And
Oh yeah, I think they have the oldest synagogue in India is in Kerala.
Yeah, in Cochin, yeah.
Cochin.
It's on the Market Street, but it doesn't have prayers, Friday prayers. When we were there,
there are not enough people.
not enough
to have
8
a million
people.
with-
Yeah, but they do have it on the day that there are Jewish people there.
Exactly.
Please stay on Friday because they only men. They need 8 men,
10.
10 or yeah, something like that. Because this woman
Quorum.
is telling us that we need 8 men or 10 men, and without men they can't have prayers.
I went to a synagogue in Warsaw. Where is it in Poland? In Krakow.
Yeah.
And there they said only men are allowed, right? In that synagogue. A bit like some of our
Usually the
mosques
women
here,
separate.
but
They go up.
but the mosques of old, they had both. And even the mosques here, they have both, except that the arrangements are separately made. It's not like a church where you sit side by side.
Yeah. It's like a temple. In temples in Nisden, I don't know if anyone has been there, but when it opens, it's a sight worth seeing. Don't bother go to India to see temples. But this one is amazing. Really. All the marble carving. But men and women sit separately. Men on one side, women. I suppose there's a reason because you know what, a temple is an open place, so anyone can walk in. And when there's a crowd, the women don't like, to be too close to men at that time. There are all kinds of people around. So
The men didn't want the women next to them.
the men don't want women. You know, sometimes it's like in Regent's Park Mosque, because I was once teaching multicultural education and we took some people, that was 30 years. The women are on the top and the men are downstairs or something, isn't it?
Oh yeah, in the register, that's right. They have a separate sort of quarters, as it were,
Yeah,
and they look down on the imam who's
yeah.
giving
But
the
if,
sort of talks.
but there's a big mosque in Abu Dhabi, and once we were on a cruise there and we went there, and it's a huge mosque, and people said it's worth seeing it. So
Yes, I've seen that.
yeah, and the thing is that women have to wear a burqa, but you know what? It's so easy. They give you one. It's just a piece of black thing that you wear over you. But it's a fantastic mosque, you know. I mean,
Yeah, in this Regent Street Mosque, you have to, if you don't have a scarf, they give you a
Yeah.
scarf at the
Yeah, they
gate,
give
so
you
you can
some.
put a scarf. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, these are all sort of injunctions which have been really taken to many ways. The interpretations are many, and a lot of people feel that, you know,
In a way, I quite agree with it, because you're going to God's house. Now you go to somebody's house and you don't go in sort of torn jeans and, you know what I mean? You dress up properly. I mean, this is what I feel.
You have to take your shoes off always. You must take your shoes off.
Yeah, shoes off, yeah.
Yeah.
But some,
Anyway, shall we call it a day?
yeah,
Thank you very, very much.
Thank
This
you
was
all for your
interesting.
contribution.
Bye-bye.
Yeah,
Very
thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Chalo.